The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Kevin DeGood on the impact infrastructure projects can have on the goals of opportunity, equity, and sustainability. Plus, Bill Press with Sara Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Kevin DeGood says the recently passed infrastructure bill is a powerful investment in jobs for American workers. But the work is not over. It's now up to us to make sure those investments advance inclusive economic growth and national climate goals. And we say hello to Kevin DeGood, Director of Infrastructure Policy at American Progress. His work focuses on how highway, transit, aviation, and maritime policy affect America's global competitiveness, access to opportunity for diverse communities, and environmental sustainability. Kevin DeGood, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And the pleasure is ours for sure. So we finally have an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Yay. And the White House called it a monumental step forward as a nation. Is that how you would describe it?
This bill is a huge win, both substantively and politically. I think, politically right off the bat, it shows the American people that the Biden administration has delivered on one of its central campaign promises. The president ran on a platform of delivering generational infrastructure improvements, including those that have positive climate effects. And he's absolutely done that. Substantively, this bill is a big boost in overall federal spending, both on highways and public transportation and passenger rail, but also in other essential areas, and that includes broadband access, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, environmental remediation, cleanup of things like abandoned industrial brownfields properties. There's just a lot in this bill. Army Corps of Engineers for shipping and navigation. So there's just many components in here that is going to ultimately boost the American economy in the long run, but also create millions of jobs. And I want to focus on that last part for just a minute, because we often just throw around big numbers in Washington and assume that it'll create jobs. In this case, there really is a lot of truth to that, because these expenditures are going to be over a number of years. And one of the things that we know from macroeconomic policy is that private sector firms, respond in terms of hiring and making orders for new factory equipment and things like that when they have a strong sense that there's going to be sustained demand going forward. And because this bill involves big expenditures for a number of years, many of these firms are going to be going out and doing some aggressive hiring. But it's not just the firms that are directly involved in infrastructure construction projects. Of course, there's all the other manufacturing that feeds into those firms, and then the other businesses that are going to benefit because workers have money to spend. So somebody who's directly employed in construction activity has to turn around and buy a car and have dinner and buy new clothes and do all of these things. And so there's a ripple effect where the kind of full macroeconomic impact of this $1.2 trillion is really going to positively touch a lot of people's lives.
In terms of actual investment in infrastructure, what do you see as some of the most significant achievements of this act?
Well, the big one for me that jumps out is transit and intercity passenger rail. Both of those are generational investments in terms of their scale. And there are so many places where we have significant highway congestion, but we don't have a good intercity passenger rail alternative. And this bill is going to allow this administration to put some rails down and to both improve existing service, and that's improve in terms of average speed performance, but also on-time performance. Something that a lot of folks don't necessarily know is that Amtrak, which is our national intercity passenger rail provider, the only track in the nation that it actually owns and controls is the rails between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. Everywhere else in the country where Amtrak provides intercity passenger service, it's actually riding on rails that are owned and controlled by a freight rail company. And what that means is a lot of conflicts, and you get poor on-time performance and poor average speed performance because passenger trains are so often stuck behind slow-moving freight. And what this bill is going to do is provide money to improve those routes, in particular, so that there are many more passing zones where intercity passenger traffic can go around slower moving freight traffic so that it can maintain that high average speed and maintain that strong on-time performance. So there's just a lot in here that's good.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and you mentioned a lot of it, right there at the top of just how reaching this bill is, and this act, and in terms of job creation, how much of an impact do you see there?
Well, it's big, and oftentimes you see, particularly on the highway side, we probably have the tightest estimates of job creation for highway construction. And you have to think about it in sort of three categories, at least the labor economists do, and that's direct job creation, indirect job creation, and induced job creation. And that gets back to what I was mentioning a few minutes ago, which is just when you get these big expenditures on, a multi-$100 million or say multi-billion-dollar highway project, you have all of the firms that are involved directly in that work. And that can be everything from people that are actually out on the roadway laying down, rebar and concrete and paving and things like that. But it can also be part of that longer supply chain. So the gravel and the concrete are going to be sourced across the country and sometimes globally. The different machinery that goes into that work, it's all kind of connected together. And then again, it's those downstream expenditures by the workers themselves, firms that do heavy construction and transportation, or whether that's water, those firms have to go out and hire other businesses to help them. They're going to hire firms to do taxes. They're going to hire firms to help them borrow money. They're going to go out and they have to have insurance, right? All of those firms have other businesses that they're also purchasing goods and services from. So it's really this compounding, multiplying effect when you get these kinds of big fiscal expenditures from Washington, and not just big, but big over an arch of time, so that these firms can do longer term planning. The money that the Biden administration and Democrats pushed through in March of this year, the American Rescue Plan, that money was really about immediately stabilizing businesses and household balance sheets. That was about preventing additional layoffs. That was about providing emergency financial aid so that people could continue to stay in their apartment or their home, so that they continue to have food, continue to have health care, right? Those expenditures were about the short term. And generally speaking, businesses don't tend to make big decisions about hiring new workers or new capital upgrades, whether that's new equipment, a new factory, whatever it might be, with those kinds of shorter term, measures, because again, it's about stabilization. That's why people talk about the infrastructure bill in terms of investment, right? That this is about, years worth of expenditures. And part of what we're trying to achieve, of course, is not just job creation, although that's really beneficial. What we're also trying to do is make our systems both more efficient and more environmentally sustainable. And what that means is, when you think about things like highway congestion or airport congestion, and how you can get unplanned outages in the electrical grid, all of those add up across the economy to sap our overall growth and productivity. And when you make smart, targeted investments in that underlying infrastructure that helps the economy run, what you're doing is you're reducing those outages, you're reducing that uncertainty, and you're allowing the country's overall economic production to happen in a more efficient manner.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Kevin DeGood, Director of Infrastructure Policy at American Progress, talking today about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And Kevin, at a time when there is such division in politics, and that may be a gross understatement. How do you understand why the act was able to win bipartisan support?
That's a great question. I think it's really a reflection of the president's commitment in order to try to work on a bipartisan basis. That's not always possible. I mean, earlier we saw, Republican intransigence around the debt ceiling. There's Republican opposition to the Build Back Better agenda, which is a mixture of both social expenditures and additional climate-related investments. So it's not always possible, but I think it speaks to the quality of the bill that Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate, as well as certainly the president and his team, were able to put together. That in the end, I want to say it got 13 Senate Republicans to vote for it. And again, it's just because it's got a smart mix of investments.
Mm-hmm. Now, back in June, you wrote a report on the impact of infrastructure projects on the goals of opportunity, equity, and sustainability. In what ways can infrastructure projects actually work against those goals?
That's a great question. And I think it helps for us to sort of step back and think about the ways in which infrastructure and the built environment around us can really affect our choices and how those choices have climate and equity implications. Here I live in Washington, D.C., and my wife and I, we have a car we've had for about 5 years, and that car only now has 28,000 miles on it. And that's not particularly because of any strenuous environmental commitment on our part. It's really because where we live in the city makes it so much easier to take care of the things we need to take care of day to day without having to get into a car. Certainly it's there and we use it on any number of occasions, but it's a transportation system that is really balanced. For shorter trips, it's safe and convenient to walk. There's great walking infrastructure. For slightly longer trips, there's great transit availability. So the buses and the rail come frequently, so we know we don't have long wait times. And then for trips where we're taking big, heavy stuff, or we've got to go longer, load up the kids, whatever it may be, well, then the car is there. But for too many Americans, they have been boxed into a living situation where they have to use a car for absolutely everything, whether that's literally going down the street to visit a friend or to get a gallon of milk or to go cross country. Like, the car is the only choice. And that just means a lot more emissions. So a few years ago, the transportation sector collectively overtook power generation as the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions for the United States. And we are sort of living with the consequences of decades and decades and decades of sustained highway investment that was, quite frankly, too much on highways and not enough in terms of transit and passenger rail. And so one of the great things about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that just passed in the House and the president's going to sign is that it seeks to kind of rebalance and to provide people with more options so that they don't always have to drive. But the paper that you were referencing back was also one that took a look at some historical examples. And unfortunately, there are far too many times in our country's history, particularly during the peak years of interstate highway construction in the 1960s and the 1970s, where transportation planners at the state level, often using federal dollars and a combination of some state dollars, very intentionally placed interstate highways right through the heart of Black neighborhoods and Black business districts. And that was done for a lot of reasons. Some of it was just outright racism and an attempt to do harm and to break up Black communities. And some of it was sort of a byproduct of the fact that when you have legal segregation and discrimination built into your laws, then those communities you're discriminating against, by definition, don't have the same kind of political power to go in and lobby and to say, hey, we need to find a better place to put this highway than right through the backyards of our fellow community members. And so again, the legacy of that damage, the legacy of that harm is one that we are still living with to this day. And I will say it's something that's very well known inside of the transportation community, but is not something which has historically made it much beyond those four walls. And I have been deeply heartened to hear the president and especially Secretary Buttigieg talk so openly and honestly about that legacy of racism and discrimination that's built into a lot of our infrastructure policy, with the goal of using the dollars that are in this bill to try to remediate some of that harm.
And Kevin, as this infrastructure plan rolls out, what needs to be put in place to advance opportunity, equity, and sustainability?
Well, part of it comes down to making project selection decisions. So a big chunk of this money will flow to state departments of transportation through formulas in the law. It means states don't have to apply for those dollars. They're just going to come every single year regardless. And those states are the ones that control what it is that they're going to build with that federal money. And so for people that care about these issues, the advocacy really needs to be, starting now at the state level to make sure that state DOTs and governors and their administrations prioritize projects that are the least impactful, both to natural environments and to our neighborhoods and communities, but also those that are going to redress, past discriminatory harms. Now, having said that, there is a pretty big chunk of money broken up over a number of different programs that will be controlled by Secretary Buttigieg and the U.S. Department of Transportation. Those are competitive grant programs. And that's where this administration has a great deal of latitude to design their project selection process in such a way as to reward those projects that are the most economically productive, environmentally sustainable, and socially equitable. And that's where, advocates such as myself are going to be leaning on them to make sure that they do the best job possible. But again, the bill has a nice balance between the formula dollars and the discretionary money. So we got to fight on both sides of that equation.
Absolutely. Kevin DeGood, Director of Infrastructure Policy at American Progress, joining us today to discuss the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, forthcoming, I should say. Kevin, thank you so much for your time with us today. We really appreciate it. Would love to have you back again soon.
You bet. My pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing or one time in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
As a writer, I get stuck every so often straining for the right words to tell my story. Over the years, though, I've learned when to quit tying myself into mental knots over sentence construction, instead stepping back and rethinking where my story is going. This process is essentially what millions of American working families are going through this year, as record numbers of them are shocking bosses, politicians, and economists by stepping back and declaring, "We quit." Most of the quits are tied to very real abuses that have become ingrained in our workplaces over the past couple of decades. Poverty paychecks, no health care, unpredictable schedules, no child care, understaffing, forced overtime, unsafe jobs, sexist and racist managers, tolerance of aggressively rude customers, and so awful much more. Specific grievances abound, but at the core of each is a deep, inherently destructive executive suite malignancy, disrespect. The corporate system has cheapened employees from valuable human assets worthy of being nurtured and advanced to a bookkeeping expense that must be steadily eliminated. It's not just about paychecks. It's about feeling valued, feeling that the hierarchy gives a damn about the people doing the work. Yet, corporate America is going out of its way to show that it doesn't care. And of course, workers notice. So unionization is booming. Millions who were laid off by the pandemic are refusing to rush back to the same old grind, and now millions who have jobs are quitting. This is much more than an unusual unemployment stat. It's a sea change in people's attitude about work itself and life. This is Jim Hightower saying people are rethinking where their story is going and how they can take it in a better direction. Yes, nearly everyone will eventually return to work, but workers themselves have begun redefining the job and rebalancing it with life. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Sara Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants.
Let me put this in perspective. We're on track to have more incidents in 2021 than in the entire history of aviation. And air rage was an issue that we started to deal with in the 1990s. We started to see some of these events happening. And so we worked really hard to get Congress to put in place penalties and fines. And that's what you hear about today. You hear about the FAA fining people. And then you also hear that we have been calling for the Department of Justice to prosecute, criminally prosecute, because anyone who is interfering with our duties or assaulting a crew member can face up to 20 years in prison. We need those consequences to be in place. After we got this in place, and we got it in the year 2000, it took a little while to get implemented. But as events continued to go up around the world, once we started having prosecutions, people faced jail time and fines, and that was reported out publicly. Events went down in the U.S. So we know that this works. This can serve as a very effective deterrent. And we need every possible thing to have people think, do I really want to act out on a plane? But back to your original question about why is this happening? What's going on? I do need to note that about 3/4 of the events are mask related, or they're reported as mask related. That doesn't mean that was the only thing going on. There's a couple things there about that. We are reporting these incidents as we got the federal mandate in January, late January. And so that required then reporting on that issue. And now that this is a new issue, you're seeing more reports. So some of that can just be related to this is a new safety requirement. We're hearing about it more. We're reporting on it now. But typically what we're finding out there is that it's not the masks that are creating the violence. There is something else going on. There is this idea that we're at conflict with each other. People are very angry. We also have essentially everyone on our plane is a first-time flyer. So we're answering questions. Our duties at boarding are a lot heavier. And our members told us through a survey that we conducted this summer that 50% of the events, they saw some troubling factors happening in the gate area or during the boarding process. Now, if you think about it, once you get up in the air, there's not a lot of options that you have for dealing with these things. If you could take at least 50% of these events and keep them on the ground, we'd be in a better place. But we are understaffed. We are, staffed at minimums. And so it's very difficult for us to see them, or even when we see these issues, get to them and deal with them, because everybody has questions about where do I put my bags? Where do I sit? Oh, somebody's sitting in my seat. And there's a lot going on. So we could do more to keep the problems on the ground. But I have to tell you, this starts first and foremost with communication from leadership. And people do not know what to believe today. They don't know why rules are in place and why they exist and why we have to enforce them. They've been told that any kind of instruction to them is an interference with their own personal liberties. And that has been, the political speech that has led us to this place.
That's sort of like the trickle down, right, from the political speech to
Yes. I mean, not only have people died, we know the COVID numbers, right? But people on the front lines in retail, I mean, can you imagine the people who work on commission in retail and have to deal with this stuff on the front lines? The people doing mass transit, the nurses in hospitals, and the flight attendants, the teachers in the schoolrooms, and the flight attendants on the planes. We are dealing with the fallout of public leaders saying that this is all political, leading people to this place of not even having the same set of facts to deal with. And when you have that, when you keep people on edge for that long, people naturally are anxious. We know this as flight attendants. We deal with people all the time. It's not good to keep people in a state of not knowing what to believe. And it causes people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise.
How many, I as a frequent flyer myself, and by the way, I have the utmost respect and admiration for flight attendants and what they have to put up with, and the service that they provide. I just admire them so much, and you, Sara, too, and your leadership. But how much of these incidents is alcohol related?
So our members told us in the survey that 58% of the incidents included alcohol, and oftentimes that's alcohol that's consumed before people even get on the plane.
Right. That's what I was thinking. Sure. Mm-hmm. And there's really no control over that, right? You look at the bars in the airports, any time of day, there are people sitting at that bar before they get on their flight, right?
Well, we have a problem. I am testifying before the Homeland Security Committee later today. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is the fact that during coronavirus, we moved to a to-go system for food and beverages. And as the airlines or the airports and concessionaires are trying to make up money, their biggest moneymaker is alcohol. So now what we've seen is they figure out, we can sell more if people can take it away. So they're pushing to go alcohol. And it is in direct conflict with the federal regulations that you cannot serve yourself in an airport or on an airplane. And it's also pushing this idea that you should drink as much as you can. And the regulations also say that you cannot board an aircraft inebriated. Now, we may or may not be able to identify that when someone's coming on the plane, but when they get up in the air and that aircraft is pressurized to 8,000 feet, that alcohol is also going to affect them differently.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So overall, the airlines took a big hit, of course, during the pandemic. They're struggling to get back now. Are they ready to come back? Do they have enough resources, enough planes, enough crew?
Well, Bill, I'm very proud of what our union did to put in place the Workers First package in COVID relief for the airline industry. Affected 2.1 million workers. And what we did was we got the relief money that went to the airlines could only be spent on workers' pay and benefits. They could not furlough us. They could not reduce our pay rates, and it banned stock buybacks and capped executive compensation. And those bans are still going on right now. So it was an incredibly effective program to keep workers in place, because if we had not had that program and the airlines had just furloughed 80% of their staff, because that's where we were, that's how bad things were, then to get them back onto the job, trained again, recertified, that takes time. And so the airlines would not even be here at all. What we are seeing the effects of is what happened prior to coronavirus, when this country moved from, one person doing a 40-hour work week and that being enough to live on and have benefits and be able to have a good life, to stripping that back and making it so that people have to work more to make more. That happened in the airline industry after 9/11 with all of the bankruptcies. And so the productivity was driven through the roof, where previously there might have been one person doing the work for these flights. And now it takes half that number. So one person is doing the work of what two people used to do at the airlines. So now in coronavirus, when you have people who are being more diligent about actually taking sick leave when they're sick, because there's so much concern around that, and also, getting the vaccine, and they may need to take an extra sick day for the recovery there. or they're looking at what's happening to them on board and getting sort of gnawed away at every time they go to work, and they're not as interested in picking up that additional trip. So what we're seeing is the results of driving the labor market to higher and higher productivity, and now people are just not willing to do it. They're not willing to give that much of themselves. They've had a chance to sit back and see their families and see what's going on. And also the conditions at work are horrible. And so that's what you're seeing in some of the staffing problems around the airlines right now.
Right. They're just not ready to come back to business as usual, I guess, right?
Which is working at 150 or 200% of what would normally be a full-time job. Yes.
Right. One contradiction that I saw, there was so much concern among the public about flying during COVID, and yet there are very few cases of people who actually got COVID from flying on a plane, right? I mean,
we have been tracking this, and the incidents, what happened throughout COVID is that the incidence of contracting COVID on the plane, where you can actually identify that, was following the same national rates of infections everywhere else. So it wasn't as though when you got on a plane, you were more at risk. Now, that's only because of the steps that we took.
Exactly.
So we had enhanced cleaning, we had the HEPA filtration in the air filtration system, and we had the masks. The masks were critically important because on an airplane, for sure, you cannot properly socially distance. So having all of those things in place helped to keep the airplane and the airports a more controlled environment. And I want to take some credit for that. I mean, that's because we're 80% union, and we were in there pushing these things with our management and working with them. And I think we were very effective in putting in place a pretty controlled environment. But what it meant was that you weren't at greater risk by getting on a plane than going somewhere else.
Is there a vaccination mandate for airline employees, or should there be?
There effectively is a vaccine mandate for airline employees. And some airlines have actually put those mandates in place. Others are in the process of doing that. But it kind of doesn't matter what the airlines do, because airline networks are worldwide. And so people have to meet the standards of other countries as well. And other countries have vaccine mandates in place. So if you're an airline employee, you're going to have to get vaccinated, no matter what your airline has said at this point. The other thing is that a lot of people forget this, but airlines are major government contractors. Yeah, and so all of the government contractors are subject to that vaccine mandate.
Right. Now, Sarah, a lot of the problems that we've talked about here and challenges facing flight attendants and other workers for the airline industry are writ large in the American economy today, as the economy recovers from COVID and people face these challenges about whether to go back to work or whether not, or are they going to accept the same conditions or not? Some people see this as sort of, this is the workers' best moment, right? Because workers have more power and more opportunities and more choices now than ever before. Do you see it that way?
Well, I mean, I do. The conditions certainly are helpful for that. I think that anytime that workers in this country understand that they actually have the power, that the corporations have control and money, but workers actually have the power, they create all the value and they can withhold that value too.
Yeah, right.
So I don't think that fundamentally this changes that dynamic. What's different right now is, of course, that there's a tight labor market because of the conditions you were describing. Right. But also, working people saw that they don't have to be ashamed of not making ends meet, because during coronavirus, everybody kind of stopped and they saw, oh my God, they're pushing us into unsafe workspaces. So this isn't just about whether or not I can get by. They are actually looking at me as disposable. And I think the American people across the board, working people, are really fed up with it. They're like, we're not a family here at this corporation. You're not treating me like a family member, and my work, what does it matter to you? If you're going to treat me as disposable, then clearly you don't really value what I'm giving to this company to make it great. So I think that there is that shared experience coming out of this where workers are saying, enough already. I can't protect my family. I can't get proper health care, and I can't even think about retiring. And it's enough. So we have to organize in the millions right now, because this is going to be a fleeting moment if we don't. If you don't lock in unions and have the legal protections that you gain by having a union, then you can walk off the job. You can have management meet your demands. But then the next day, they can revert back. And unlikely they would do it the next day. But as soon as the labor market loosens up a little bit and they're feeling maybe a little more control, or they can hire other people, they're going to go right back. So if you don't lock it in black and white with a union, it's not going to stay that way. You're not going to make lasting change.
Well, as a lifetime union member and a strong pro-union person, worker myself, I mean, it seems to me that this is the best possible time for unions to organize, right? I mean, we see that now with this new Starbucks thing, with Amazon and others. Do you feel that within the labor movement that there is a reawakened interest in the opportunities that a union provides?
Look, I think that unions are recognizing that this is a moment. I don't know that we're fully, grabbing this moment to its greatest potential of what we can really achieve or help workers find. If you look back even before coronavirus, the Business Roundtable and the Chamber were actually identifying that maybe we've pushed workers a little too hard. You can go back and look at some of their statements and some of the concerns that they had, and they actually talked about a worker revolt. And that's where we were. And so, I think as a labor movement, we should be organizing in the millions, but we should also be going to these corporations and saying, it's time that you work with us. It is time, because you're going to have you're experiencing it now. If you don't get busy understanding that a collective bargaining relationship is good for your business, like, let's lock that in. Let's figure out where we can get neutrality agreements and organize without them fighting us, without them spending money on fighting us. That is their best chance of having stability. That's their best chance of saving our democracy. And there may be some who are open to that dialogue, but we need to be pushing these discussions and pushing these demands as a labor movement on the whole.
Bill Press with Sara Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Kevin DeGood, Donald Cohen, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.